What would you do if you discovered that the disturbing legends about a secluded family living in the mountains of West Virginia were not just stories told to frighten children, but documented cases that authorities had tried to bury for decades? The air feels heavier as we approach the abandoned Blackwood property, a sprawling farmhouse nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where the boundaries between isolation and depravity blurred into something unimaginable. The weathered structure stands as a monument to horrors that many locals still refuse to acknowledge, the wooden beams groaning under the weight of secrets spanning 3 generations. If this kind of historical investigation intrigues you, consider subscribing to continue our journey into America's darkest forgotten corners. The first official record of the Blackwood family appears in the County Register of 1903, when Thomas Blackwood purchased nearly 500 acres of remote forest land, using cash that no one could account for. According to Land Office documentation, Blackwood arrived with his wife Martha and their 7 daughters, all between the ages of 4 and 16. The transaction raised few eyebrows at the time, as the post-Civil War era saw many families seeking isolation and self-sufficiency away from the growing industrialization of American cities. The local newspaper, the Westland Courier, published only a brief mention of the new arrivals, noting that Mr. Blackwood expresses a desire for privacy and intends to establish a sustainable homestead, removed from the corrupting influences of modern society. Former county clerk Harold Jennings, whose grandfather processed the original deed, provided our research team with yellowed documents from the family archive. The papers reveal that Blackwood paid nearly twice the asking price for the land on the condition that no questions would be asked about his previous residence or occupation. The clerk's personal notes, never before made public, indicate his impression of the patriarch as a man of intimidating presence with peculiar religious notions who kept his daughters uncommonly quiet and obedient. The documentation shows that Martha Blackwood signed her portion of the paperwork with a simple X, suggesting either illiteracy or perhaps something more troubling about her role within the family structure. The Blackwoods wasted no time in establishing their isolation. Within months, they had constructed a large 2-story farmhouse and several outbuildings without hiring any local labor. Delivery records from the Westland General Store show massive orders of supplies, tools, and building materials that would have required substantial manpower to transport up the winding mountain roads. Yet no one reported seeing anyone other than Thomas Blackwood himself collecting these orders. Store ledgers recovered from the County Historical Society reveal notations questioning how a single man could have transported such heavy loads alone, particularly items like cast iron stoves and bed frames that typically required multiple handlers. Former postal worker Elijah Crawford, whose father served the route that included the Blackwood property, shared a disturbing detail from his father's journal. Pa wrote that in 3 years of deliveries, he never once saw any of the women or girls, despite hearing female voices from inside the house. Mr. Blackwood always met him at the edge of the property, never allowing him closer to the main house. Pa noted that the man seemed unusually concerned about official documents, subscribing to multiple newspapers but refusing any mail that required signatures or records. But there was one detail that troubled the postal carrier even more, as noted. In his personal log dated April 1907, "Delivered package today and heard what sounded like a woman crying from the barn. When I inquired, Blackwood explained it away as a new calf separated from its mother, but I've heard enough birthing livestock to know the difference between animal and human distress. Something isn't right up there, but without cause or warrant. There's nothing to be done." The first real indication that something sinister was occurring at the Blackwood property came in the winter of 1908, nearly 5 years after their arrival. According to medical records preserved in the State Archive, local physician Dr. Samuel Porter was summoned to the property to attend to what was described as a difficult childbirth. The doctor's detailed notes, sealed until 1965 due to their sensitive nature, describe his arrival at the farm during a snowstorm, where he found not Martha Blackwood in labor, but the eldest daughter, Catherine, aged 21. The doctor's journal, now housed in the State Medical Historical Collection, contains this chilling entry. The young woman was clearly in distress, both physical and emotional. Upon examination, I determined this was not her first pregnancy, despite no record of her marriage in the county. When I inquired about the father, Mr. Blackwood became hostile and reminded me that my duty was to the patient, not to questions of morality. What disturbed me most was the young woman's reaction when her father entered the room, a visible trembling that suggested terror rather than the comfort one might expect from a parent during such an ordeal. Dr. Porter's notes continue with medical details about the delivery, which resulted in a healthy male infant. However, the final paragraph of his report contains an observation that would later become central to the investigation. Upon departing, I noticed 6 other young women watching from the shadows of the hallway, at least 2 of whom appeared to be in various stages of pregnancy themselves. When I attempted to speak with them, Mr. Blackwood escorted me firmly from the premises with a warning not to return uninvited. I have grave concerns about the welfare of these women, but find myself without recourse in such a remote location, where the law seldom reaches. The doctor's concerns apparently reached the local sheriff, as county records indicate that Deputy William Hargrove made a cursory investigation the following month. His official report, just 3 sentences long, states only that he found the Blackwood family to be private but not in obvious distress, and that no evidence of criminality was observed. Later testimonies would reveal that Blackwood had been making substantial annual contributions to both the sheriff's re-election fund and the county commissioner's private charities, creating a troubling pattern of official negligence that would continue for years. What they found next would change everything about how investigators understood the depths of isolation the Blackwood family endured. A local hunter, Jonas Miller, stumbled upon a crude cemetery on the edge of the Blackwood property in the autumn of 1910. Hidden beneath overgrown brush and marked only with rough wooden crosses bearing no names, only dates, Miller counted 11 graves, some appearing to be quite small. According to his sworn statement given years later during the official investigation, Miller reported his discovery to Sheriff Taylor, who allegedly replied that whatever the Blackwoods do on their own land is their own business, especially when it comes to family burials. Miller's discovery might have remained just a disturbing footnote, if not for the drought of 1911, which forced the Blackwoods to venture further from their property in search of water. It was during one of these excursions that 16-year-old Elizabeth Blackwood, the youngest daughter, encountered a traveling Bible salesman named George Hartford. Hartford's detailed account, preserved in a series of letters to his brother, describes meeting a painfully shy young woman with no knowledge of the outside world, who begged him for books but insisted he never mention their meeting to her father. Hartford, concerned by the girl's obvious fear and isolation, arranged to leave a package of books hidden beneath the distinctive rock formation near the property boundary. Over the next 2 months, he and Elizabeth exchanged letters hidden in this same location, with the young woman gradually revealing horrifying details about life within the Blackwood household. These letters, later recovered during the investigation, contain the first direct testimony about the true nature of the family's existence. Father says the outside world is filled with sin and corruption, and that God has commanded him to create a pure lineage through his own bloodline, Elizabeth wrote in one particularly disturbing passage. When each of my sisters turned 13, they were taken to the special room in the East Wing where Father says they must fulfill their divine purpose. Mother tried to stop it once, years ago when it began with Catherine, but Father locked her in the root cellar for so long that when she came out, she never spoke against him again. Elizabeth's letters describe a household governed by strict religious doctrine, invented entirely by Thomas Blackwood, centered around his belief that the apocalypse was imminent and only his purified bloodline would survive. The letters mention multiple pregnancies among all 7 daughters, with many of the resulting children not surviving infancy due to what Elizabeth called the sickness that comes from father's blood mixing too closely with itself. Those infants were buried in the cemetery that the hunter had discovered, while the surviving children were being raised to continue what Blackwood called God's great experiment in purity. But there was one detail even more disturbing that Elizabeth revealed in her final letter. Father has begun preparing my nephew Thomas Jr. for his sacred duties when he turns 16 next year. He says the bloodline must continue even if something happens to him. I cannot bear to think of my sister's son being taught to continue this abomination. I am planning to escape during the spring gathering expedition and will try to bring as many of the younger children as I can. If you do not hear from me by the first day of May, please alert the authorities in Charleston, not the local sheriff who has been paid for his silence. Hartford never received another letter. According to his testimony, he waited until mid-May before traveling to the county seat in Charleston to report his concerns to state authorities. The resulting investigation was delayed by jurisdictional disputes and the outbreak of World War I, which diverted resources and attention from domestic matters. It wasn't until 1915 that a proper investigation was launched, led by state investigator James Morrison, whose meticulous notes form the backbone of what we know about the case. Morrison's investigation began with interviews in the surrounding communities, where he discovered a pattern of local knowledge and deliberate ignorance about the Blackwood situation. According to his notes, the residents of Westland County have constructed an elaborate system of justifications for ignoring what many suspect is occurring on the Blackwood property. Some cite respect for privacy and religious freedom. Others fear Thomas Blackwood's rumored violent temper. But most troubling are those who have benefited financially from Blackwood's apparent wealth, including several county officials who should have been most vigilant. Armed with Hartford's letters and growing community testimony, Morrison obtained a warrant to inspect the Blackwood property in June 1915. His official report, later classified until 1967 due to its disturbing content, describes what his team discovered upon arrival. The main house was found abandoned, with evidence suggesting a hasty departure approximately 2 weeks prior to our arrival. The interior revealed a household organized with military precision, with separate quarters for Thomas Blackwood in the west wing, a dormitory-style arrangement for his 7 daughters in the south wing, and a nursery in the north wing containing 11 beds of various sizes. Morrison's team discovered a locked room in the east wing, referenced in Elizabeth's letters as the special room. Behind the reinforced door, they found what appeared to be a ceremonial space containing a large bed draped in white linens, walls covered with handwritten religious texts that scholars would later confirm were not from any recognized scripture, and a crude altar bearing a leather-bound journal. This journal, written in Thomas Blackwood's hand and spanning nearly 12 years, would become the most damning evidence in the case. The journal detailed Blackwood's delusional religious ideology, which he claimed came to him through divine revelation during a fever in 1902. He wrote of being chosen to cleanse humanity through controlled bloodlines, and described in clinical detail his breeding program with his own daughters, including schedules, fertility tracking, and disturbing notes on which combinations produced superior specimens. Most chilling were his plans for the next generation, in which he intended his grandsons to continue the lineage with their mothers and sisters once they reached maturity. However, Morrison's team discovered one thing even more disturbing than the journal. Behind a false wall in the root cellar, they found Martha Blackwood, Thomas's wife, chained to a support beam and in a state of severe malnourishment and psychological trauma. According to the medical examiner's report, she had been kept in these conditions for approximately 7 years, fed just enough to keep her alive, but subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation and abuse. When questioned, she was able to provide only fragmented information, repeatedly stating that Thomas said it was God's will, and that the girls stopped crying after the first year. Martha Blackwood's testimony, recorded in fragments over several weeks as her condition stabilized, revealed that Thomas had begun his divine work even before their arrival in West Virginia, with the eldest daughter, Catherine, having already given birth to one child before they purchased the property. According to Martha, she had attempted to flee with the children in 1908, which resulted in her imprisonment in the cellar. From that point on, she had knowledge of what was happening only through sounds and brief interactions when Thomas would bring her food. But no one could locate Thomas Blackwood or any of his daughters and grandchildren. An extensive search of the surrounding forest revealed only the small cemetery, now containing 17 graves, some very recent, according to soil analysis. A nationwide alert was issued, but the family seemed to have disappeared completely. The investigation remained active until 1921, when resources were finally redirected to other cases, with the Blackwood file marked unresolved, until one piece of the puzzle revealed the unthinkable. In 1946, 31 years after the initial investigation, a routine inventory of unclaimed safety deposit boxes at the First National Bank of Charleston uncovered a box rented by Thomas Blackwood in 1914. Inside was a detailed map showing the locations of 3 other properties purchased under different names in Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina, along with documents establishing new identities for each of his daughters and their children. Most disturbing was a letter addressed to "Whoever discovers this," in which Blackwood boasted that his divine lineage would continue undetected, spreading throughout the region as part of his apocalyptic vision. According to FBI records declassified, in 1975, a task force was assembled to investigate these properties and track down any surviving members of the Blackwood family. What they discovered was a complex network of isolated communities, each originally centered around one of Blackwood's daughters and her children, who had been taught to continue the practice of close familial breeding. By the time authorities intervened, the Blackwood bloodline had expanded to nearly 100 individuals spread across 4 states, many suffering from severe genetic disorders and cognitive impairments resulting from generations of inbreeding. Dr. Eleanor Richards, who was part of the medical team that examined the Blackwood descendants, provided this assessment in her report to the Department of Health. The physical and psychological damage observed in these individuals represents one of the most severe cases of prolonged genetic isolation and inbreeding in modern medical literature. Many exhibit characteristic facial abnormalities, reduced cognitive function, and a range of congenital disorders that will require lifelong care. Perhaps most troubling are the psychological effects of multi-generational abuse and isolation, which have created a population entirely divorced from normal social development and understanding. The 1946 investigation led to the identification and rescue of 73 living descendants of Thomas Blackwood, ranging in age from infants to adults in their 30s. Court records show that 39 of these individuals required institutional care due to severe physical or cognitive disabilities, while the others underwent extensive rehabilitation and were eventually placed with foster families or supportive living arrangements. The adults who were deemed to have participated knowingly in continuing Blackwood's practices were charged with various crimes, though many were found incompetent to stand trial due to their lifelong indoctrination and isolation. Thomas Blackwood himself was never found. The last confirmed record of his existence is a property purchase in rural Georgia dated 1932, when he would have been approximately 70 years old. Some investigators theorized that he died of natural causes sometime in the 1930s, while others believed he may have established yet another isolated community that remained undiscovered. The FBI file on Blackwood remained active until 1960, when it was officially closed with his status listed as presumed deceased. However, there was something even more disturbing that emerged during the rehabilitation of the Blackwood descendants. Several of the older individuals, when interviewed separately, told similar stories about grandfather's other families in places as far away as Oregon and New Mexico. According to their testimonies, Thomas Blackwood had spoken of 17 branches of the pure bloodline established across America, each unaware of the other's existence, but following the same practices outlined in his religious doctrine. Ethel Jenkins, a social worker who spent 5 years working with the rescued Blackwood descendants, recorded this chilling statement from one of the older women. "Grandfather told us that when the end times came, all the branches of the family would recognize each other by the mark we all carry, and together we would inherit the cleansed earth. He said there were hundreds of us by now, all living according to the true way, all keeping the bloodline pure as he commanded." FBI analysts determined that the woman was likely repeating propaganda used to control the family, rather than reporting fact. Nevertheless, investigators conducted discrete inquiries in several western states based on the information provided. According to heavily redacted reports, they discovered 2 small communities in rural Oregon and Arizona with unusual patterns of genetic disorders and social isolation, but could not conclusively link them to Thomas Blackwood. Due to legal constraints and limited resources, these investigations were never fully pursued. The case of the Blackwood family represents one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse and isolation in American history, made possible by a combination of geographic remoteness, community indifference, and institutional negligence. The full extent of Thomas Blackwood's activities may never be known, as many records were sealed for decades to protect the privacy of his victims and their descendants. What is clear, however, is that the ripple effects of his actions continued to impact multiple generations long after his disappearance. Dr. Richards, who continued to work with survivors of the Blackwood case throughout her career, offered this perspective in a 1970 interview with the Journal of Psychiatric Medicine. What makes the Blackwood case uniquely horrifying is not just the abuse itself, which sadly is not without precedent, but the systematic way in which Thomas Blackwood created an entire closed society built around his delusions. He didn't just commit crimes, he established a self-perpetuating system designed to continue his vision beyond his own lifetime. In that, he was disturbingly successful, creating what amounts to a multi-generational cult centered around the most taboo form of abuse imaginable. In 1972, the Westland County Historical Society attempted to create an educational exhibit about the case as a way to examine how community silence enables abuse. The exhibit was canceled after descendants of several county officials named in the original investigation threatened legal action. According to society records, the materials collected for the exhibit, including photographs of the Blackwood property and copies of original documents, were placed in sealed storage with instructions that they not be made public until 2015. When researchers attempted to access these materials after that date, they discovered that the entire collection had been destroyed in a suspicious fire at the storage facility in 1983. That discovery was only the beginning of a pattern that researchers would uncover of systematic attempts to erase the Blackwood case from public record. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, historians and journalists investigating the case reported unusual difficulties, including missing archive files, denied access requests, and in some cases, direct warnings to abandon their research. Dr. Martin Lowery, who attempted to publish a comprehensive account of the case in 1988, reported receiving anonymous threatening letters that contained personal details about his family that were not publicly available. According to court records unsealed in 2010, several prominent families in West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky had actively worked to suppress information about the Blackwood case due to previously undisclosed connections to Thomas Blackwood's extended family. Genetic testing conducted as part of an unrelated medical study in 1995 revealed distinctive markers common among dozens of individuals throughout the Appalachian region, suggesting that Blackwood's bloodline had indeed spread, far wider than originally documented in the 1946 investigation. Former FBI analyst Richard Torres, who reviewed the case files before his retirement in 2002, offered this assessment. Based on population distribution patterns and the limited genetic data available, my conservative estimate is that there could be between 500 and 800 living descendants of Thomas Blackwood in the United States today. The vast majority would have no knowledge of their connection to this case, being several generations removed from the original events. However, the possibility remains that isolated pockets of the family continued his practices well into the modern era, particularly in remote rural areas where oversight remains minimal. Torres's analysis gained disturbing support in 2005, when authorities in rural Idaho discovered a compound housing 37 individuals living in conditions strikingly similar to those documented in the original Blackwood case. The leader of this group, who called himself Thomas Shepard, possessed a handwritten copy of what appeared to be Blackwood's religious doctrine, though he claimed to have received these teachings through divine revelation. Genetic testing later confirmed a familial connection to the Blackwood lineage, suggesting he was likely a great-grandson of Thomas Blackwood himself. The Idaho case prompted a renewed interest in tracking the extended Blackwood family, though privacy laws and ethical concerns complicated these efforts. In 2008, the Centers for Disease Control established a confidential registry to monitor the unusual genetic disorders associated with the Blackwood lineage, both to provide appropriate medical care to affected individuals and to identify potential cases of continued abuse. According to anonymized data published in 2015, the registry had identified over 300 individuals with genetic markers consistent with the Blackwood pattern, spread across 27 states. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a genetic counselor who worked with the registry program, noted in her research, the geographic distribution suggests at least 4 distinct family branches that remained isolated from general population intermarriage for multiple generations. While 3 of these branches show evidence of integration with the broader population beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, one group centered in the rural South appears to have maintained significant genetic isolation until at least the 1990s, raising troubling questions about whether some aspect of Blackwood's practices continued into recent times. In 2018, an anonymous package arrived at the offices of the Southern Poverty Law Center containing what appeared to be original journals kept by Elizabeth Blackwood, the youngest daughter, who had attempted to escape in 1915. The journals, which forensic analysis confirmed were authentic period documents, revealed that Elizabeth had indeed fled with 3 young children, but had been recaptured by her father within days. Rather than returning them to the main family compound, Thomas Blackwood had taken them to one of his secondary properties in North Carolina, where Elizabeth remained essentially a prisoner until her death in 1957. Elizabeth's journals provide a disturbing first-hand account of Thomas Blackwood's evolving delusions over 4 decades, including his growing conviction that his pure bloodline would develop supernatural abilities through continued interbreeding. She documented the birth of 27 children and grandchildren during her captivity, many of whom were sent to establish new family branches in other locations once they reached maturity. Perhaps most chillingly, she described how her father trained his grandsons to continue his practices and religious doctrine after his death, which she recorded as occurring in 1942. The final entry in Elizabeth's journal, dated March 3, 1957, reads, "Father's vision continues to spread like a disease across this country. Even as I feel my own life fading, I know that somewhere his chosen ones are continuing what he started. I have failed in my duty to stop this abomination. May God forgive me for my weakness, and may someone someday find these words and understand that the evil has not ended, but only scattered to take root elsewhere. Look for those who speak of blood purity and who shun the outside world. They carry his madness still." The investigation into the extended Blackwood family continues to this day, though it receives little public attention or official acknowledgement. Researchers and law enforcement officials working on the case report an unusual reluctance among agencies to dedicate resources to what many consider a historical matter with diminishing relevance. Yet every few years, a new discovery suggests that the case is far from closed. In 2021, a routine DNA sample submitted to a genealogy website led to the identification of a small community in rural Missouri where genetic markers consistent with weight. The Blackwood pattern appeared in concerning concentration. Preliminary investigation revealed a group of approximately 50 individuals living in relative isolation, all descended from a man who arrived in the area in the 1950s, calling himself Thomas Wright. While no evidence of continuing abuse was documented, researchers noted the community's unusual emphasis on maintaining family purity and their resistance to outside contact or influence. Dr. James Harrison, who has studied the Blackwood case and its aftermath for over 15 years, offers this sobering assessment. What makes this case uniquely disturbing is its longevity and reach. Most family abuse situations, even multi-generational ones, eventually collapse or are exposed. But Thomas Blackwood created something that transcended his own lifetime, a self-perpetuating system based on isolation, indoctrination, and a twisted religious framework that justified the unjustifiable. The true horror of the Blackwood case isn't just what happened on that West Virginia farm over a century ago. It's the possibility that echoes of his influence continue to impact lives today in ways we have yet to fully uncover. The story of the Blackwood family serves as a disturbing reminder of how isolation, unchecked authority, and community indifference can allow unimaginable abuse to flourish across generations. It also raises troubling questions about similar situations that may exist even now in remote areas where oversight is minimal and family structures remain private. As one survivor from the 1946 investigation stated in testimony that remains relevant today, the worst part wasn't what happened. To us, it was that people suspected and did nothing. They heard the cries and looked away. That's how evil takes root and grows, not just through those who commit it, but through those who choose not to see it. As our research team packed up to leave the overgrown site where the Blackwood house once stood, local resident Martha Jenkins approached us with a worn leather pouch that had been in her family for generations. Inside was a faded photograph showing a bearded man surrounded by 7 young women with vacant expressions, all wearing identical homemade dresses. My grandmother was the midwife who delivered some of the babies before Dr. Porter got involved. She explained. She kept this as evidence in case anyone ever came asking, but nobody did for so many years that eventually people just stopped talking about it altogether. Jenkins pointed to a wooded ridge visible from where we stood. There are still folks up in those hills that don't come down except to get supplies maybe once a year. Nobody asks where they came from or who their people were. That's just the odd way it's always been around here. When asked if she thought any of them might be connected to the Blackwood lineage, she glanced nervously at the surrounding forest before responding. I couldn't say for certain, but sometimes when the wind blows just right through those trees, you can almost hear sounds that might be singing, might be crying. Some things are better left alone, especially when they've had this many years to put down roots. As we drove away from Westland County, our digital recorder captured one final observation from Dr. Harrison that perhaps best encapsulates the lasting legacy of this case. The truly terrifying aspect of the Blackwood story isn't just what bad happened, but how easily it happened, how a man with dangerous delusions could create a closed system of abuse that potentially continues to reverberate through American society a century later. It forces us to question what other Thomas Blackwoods might exist in isolated pockets of our country, even today, operating just beyond the reach of oversight or intervention. And it raises the uncomfortable question, how many people have to suffer before their cries become impossible to ignore? The Blackwood case files remain officially open in the FBI's Cold Case Division, with new information still being added as genetic testing and historical research uncover additional connections. For those descendants of the Blackwood family who have been identified and integrated into society, the legacy of their ancestors' actions continues to impact their lives in profound and often painful ways. And somewhere, perhaps in the most isolated corners of America, the last echoes of Thomas Blackwood's disturbing vision may still be playing out, unknown and undetected by the outside world he so deliberately rejected.